Have you heard the phrase sharpen the saw and wondered what it really meant or how you can apply it more in your life? Well, I want to share an embarrassing moment in my life and how I learned to take this more seriously. But first, I want to welcome you. My name is Andrea Brown. This is Thrival Now, a new YouTube channel and podcast where I'm committed to helping you go from survival to thrival in your finances so that you can be more, do more, and give more. So before I share the embarrassing moment of how I really learned to apply this key in my life, this phrase, sharpen the saw, is mostly attributed to a guy named Stephen Covey and one of the habits in his very popular book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. But the concept of sharpening the saw and what that means is actually a lot older, and you can find stories, there's a quote from Abraham Lincoln, which would be in the mid 1800s or early 1800s. And the quote from Abraham Lincoln is when he said, "Give me 6 hours to chop down a tree, and I will spend the first 4 hours sharpening the axes." So here was a man that understood that work was not just about work, but you had to take time to sharpen your axe if you wanted to be effective, which is really the premise behind what Stephen Covey's concept, Sharpen the Saw, is about. It means taking time to make your work, taking time to make your work effective. But this key is much older than Abraham Lincoln, and it can be traced back to, I want to say, a couple thousand years before Christ. And I would give credit to King Solomon for this. And he wrote a proverb that is pretty well known that says, "If the axe is dull and the blade unsharpened, more strength is needed, but wisdom brings success." So again, this concept is that you need to make time to make your work count and sharpen the saws of your life. So my modern translation of this idea is going to be paraphrased: sharpen the knife in your life. So my embarrassing moment or story that I want to share, or don't really want to share, but I will share, has to do with the fact that I didn't sharpen the knives in my life. And so it's not so much about sharpening the saw or sharpening the axe, but it's about sharpening knives. And so the background and context to this story is that I grew up in northern Canada, way up in northern BC. My dad was a big game hunter from the time I was 6 years old, for the duration of his life. But I spent almost every fall going out on multiple weekend trips with my dad from the time I was 6 till probably I was 20 or 21 years old. And so every year we would get a moose or an elk, and we would bring that home. We would process that animal and butcher that animal on our kitchen table. It would take 3 or 4 or 5 days. It was quite an ordeal. And we would put 500 pounds of meat into our deep freezers, everything you can imagine: hamburger meat, stew meat, roasts, and whatnot. And so my dad taught me at a young age and my brother and sister, how to sharpen knives, how to hone knives, how important it was, and how to do it. And we got to apply that skill. And here's the key: knowledge is information and facts, but wisdom is when you apply that knowledge. And it's vital if you want to grow in life, you want to be profitable financially, if you want to go from survival to thrival, to learn to apply the knowledge that you get as wisdom in your life. And so I knew a lot, and I'd even practiced it, but as an adult, I rarely had reason to practice this skill. Fast forward how many years later, my husband and I own multiple businesses, one of which we started was a food cart. We ended up having 2 open-air food carts, basically the equivalent of food trucks, in Central Oregon where we lived for years. And I think we're going on 10 or 11 years now that we own the businesses. I've kind of forgotten. But But we started this business, and the story that I'm going to share is about, I don't know, we were 3 or 4 years into this business. I was managing it basically. At that point, my husband was running his construction business. And so in the summers, I was managing the food cart business, and in the winters, I was working on my speaking and consulting business. And in the summers, we had multiple employees at different times, sometimes multiple ones at the same time. But what I remember is I was on my own in this situation. I can't remember if I had an employee who was working one of the other carts somewhere else. I think we only had one food cart at that point. But as it was, I found myself pressed for time. I was going to an event downtown Bend. It was a big deal. And I was late. There was something happened. I don't know if I'd forgotten something. So I'd showed up. I'd set up everything. I set up the food cart, all the food. But everything was going wrong that day, and I was in a fluster. I was not prepared for the event. It was going to start. I had to run and get other stuff, and I still had to chop a buttload of onions because one of the things we served was Philly cheesesteaks as well as gyros. But for the Philly cheesesteaks, we had to cut a huge amount of onions. And so I probably had a 25-pound bag, and half that bag had to be cut for that event that night, and I had done other prep, but not that. And it just felt like it was going to be a loss. And I was probably saying Hail Marys and prayers as I could. And just at that moment, I was getting ready I had to drive off. It was probably, I don't know, maybe an hour before the event started. I had to run and get something I'd forgotten. I was coming back. And there were 2 food trucks beside me. And amazingly, these 2 young men on each side of me had seen that I was flustered. And they were waiting. They were well prepared. They were paid to be there early. And they were twiddling their thumbs. And both these guys had independently come over and offered to help. And I was like, yeah, I've got all these onions. If you're really willing and serious, I will totally take your help. And I need it. And so they jumped in and they were going to cut my onions. And so they got things ready. And before I'd packed up to leave, one of them had picked up my knives and started to cut the onions. And he was like, these are dull. And I was mortified. I knew he was right. I couldn't remember the last time I'd sharpened my knives. And they walked over to their trailer. One of the employees had some fancy knives that he'd had. He'd been a cook for years, and he pulled out his fancy knives, and I started they jumped in, they started cutting knives. I was mortified. I drove away totally embarrassed because I was the owner of this food cart, and I didn't have sharp knives. And I knew that a lot of times. I knew I didn't have sharp knives, but we were kind of hammering through things in these early years, and it was very much survival. It was one event after the other. It was, we were living on fumes. We were just getting past that and starting to crank probably at that point, but it was still like just saving money. We weren't spending much, and it was just trying to be diligent with what he had, but I never slowed down to sharpen my knives. And I was mortified because here these employees of these other food trucks had caught me in the fact that I, as the owner and the chef, which, that I didn't have sharp knives. And so I ran off, I did my thing, I came back. I remember looking at those onions, you're gonna laugh, but I remember thinking they were the most beautifully, perfectly sliced onions that I had ever seen. They were paper thin. I had never cut onions that beautiful, paper thin, sliced up to that point. And these guys totally blessed me. I was blown away. I came back with just enough time to jump in and rocked the event. We crushed it, knocked it out of the park. But I was totally embarrassed. I was really humiliated. And I had to fight that shame of just going, okay, instead of carrying humiliation and shame, I can take this. Instead of fighting this as shame and humiliation, I can take this as a learning curve. I can just learn from it and decide I'm going to have sharp knives. And so from that point on, I started sharpening my knives. The truth is, I still was not very good at it, and it wasn't until a few years later that I had another guy come in and manage my work with me really regularly, and working alongside of him, and he was a chef. I've never identified as a chef, even though we've owned the business, and I ran it a lot of times. I'll be honest, that the food trucks, the whole concept of that was my husband's dream. It was his baby. He is the cook in our family. And so maybe that was my fail point, that I never really identified as being a chef. I was just the business owner, and I was working it and I was managing it at times. But when this fella came in and started working with me on a regular basis at a lot of events, and I got alongside him and I saw how often he was sharpening his knives and how important it was, or honing them. We can go into details, or you can look the difference up. I don't have time in this video, but the fact is, it became something I really was challenged to be diligent and take my skills to the next level and become wise in applying the knowledge that I had on a regular basis, and slowing down and making time before events to hone those knives technically as it is, as opposed, and keeping my knives sharp so that I was never in a situation where I would be embarrassed like that again. And so I give you this today because wherever you're at in survival mode, whether it is in your health, whether it's with relationships, whether it's in your finances, making time to sharpen the saw, making time to sharpen the axe, or as in my case, making time to sharpen your knives, can make a world of difference. And it can make you so much more effective in what you're doing. It's so much more confident in what you're doing. And it is a key to success. This is a principle that is 4,000 years old, and people that are successful understand the power of taking time to be diligent. I think the light's fading, so I'm going to wrap it up. I just encourage you, in whatever situation you're in, to find ways to slow down, ways to take what you know and apply it diligently in your life as wisdom. Take the knowledge that you're certain of and the keys of success that you've heard other people talk about and use in their lives, and begin to apply it as wisdom in yours. So thank you so much for joining me. I'll see you on the next video.